She looked me dead in the eye and said, "My body belongs to me. You're not entitled to a thing." And in that instant, my marriage cracked like a mirror and threw back 100 versions of myself I didn't recognize. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 34. I've been teaching third grade for nearly a decade at Meadowbrook Elementary in St. Louis, and I can tell you the exact number of days I'd been married when my wife said that: 37. 5 weeks and 2 days. 37 days of brushing teeth in the same bathroom and sleeping in separate rooms. 37 days of saying good night across a hallway like neighbors in an apartment building. 37 days of the woman I loved turning into someone whose edges I kept cutting my hands on. The brown leather couch under me creaked when I shifted. I bought it 3 years ago during a Labor Day sale, convincing myself I needed grown-up furniture, even if no one ever sat beside me on it. The irony wasn't lost on me that the first time it hosted a married couple, one of them kept to the far cushion like I was contagious. Rachel, my wife, didn't look up from her phone. Her thumb scrolled with bored accuracy, like she could do it with her eyes closed. "I'm not demanding anything," I said finally. "I'm asking why you won't even kiss me goodnight. Not once since the wedding. We used to." I stopped. Nostalgia felt obscene, like describing a meal to someone who's decided they're done eating forever. She sighed. "Ethan, I'm tired. Please don't start." "Start what?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted. "A conversation?" She set the phone on the coffee table without meeting my eyes. "It's my body. It's my choice what I do with it. I don't have to justify that to you." I stared at the framed photo on the bookshelf behind her head. Rachel in a white dress that caught the afternoon sun like a wave of light. Me beside her in a navy suit that made my mom tear up because I looked like my father. We were standing on the steps of St. Mary's Parish. The priest had called us, joined. The organ had bellowed something triumphant. We'd laughed at the pigeons lined up on the railing as if they were our tiny, feathered wedding party. Now she couldn't be bothered to touch my hand. I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich because that's what you do when there's nothing else left to do. You repeat the habits that kept you alive before the crisis. Wheat bread, turkey, Swiss, a smear of mustard because I'd forgotten to buy mayonnaise the week before. The overhead light buzzed softly. Somewhere in the apartment above ours, a blender came alive then died, a domestic sigh. I stood there chewing and realized there had been this itch in my brain for months, a small irritation I'd kept scratching around instead of at. In a premarital counseling session last spring, Rachel had said something about marriage being a stable foundation, about partnership and teamwork, not just romance. The words had rung like common sense then. We were both practical people, responsible. In the kitchen with mustard on my fingers, the words started sounding like a contract with a lot of small print I never read. The woman in our living room was not the one who used to fall asleep with her head on my chest on Saturday mornings while I marked spelling tests. The woman in our living room did not text me photos of weirdly shaped clouds because they looked like punctuation marks my students kept forgetting. That Rachel had a quiet laugh and a way of listening that made you feel like your thoughts were worth hearing. This Rachel had a fortress around her and a sign that said, "No visitors." We met at a district conference 2 autumns ago. I was leading a session on trauma-sensitive classrooms, which is a lofty title for how to keep kids from shutting down when the world outside them won't shut up. Rachel was there representing the social work department, taking notes with this focused frown that could have been mistaken for disapproval if you didn't know better. We talked afterward. I don't remember what I said. I remember what she did. She listened. She listened like she was collecting puzzle pieces, and I was handing them to her. We went for coffee, and 3 hours dissolved without either of us noticing. She told me how her parents split when she was 12 and how she started building walls after that. Not because she loved walls, but because being inside them felt safer than being outside with all the weather. I told her how my father died during my junior year of college, how grief turned my world into a fog, and how teaching was the first solid ground I found. We didn't talk about work after that. We talked about everything else: food, music, the way cities feel different at dawn than they do at midnight. I introduced her to my mother after 2 months. Mom liked her immediately, which was both a relief and a shock. My mom has opinions shaped like brick houses, and she does not hesitate to live inside them. With Rachel, she softened. "She's good for you," she said, as if I hadn't already decided that myself. For the first year, Everything felt like a long exhale after holding your breath for years. She came to school events and wrangled conversations with exhausted parents like she'd been born doing it. I took her to the farmer's market on Saturdays, and we'd fight over the last sample of cinnamon kettle corn like children. We moved into a modest two-bedroom on the south side, close enough to the park that you could hear the basketball nets thunk at dusk. We blended our furniture and our schedules, but not our money. That was Rachel's hill. She insisted we split everything: rent, utilities, groceries down to the dollar. I earn a bit more than she does, and I offered to cover more. She refused. Fairness is clarity, she said, kissing my cheek. No resentment later. I took it as maturity. I'm a teacher. I love when people plan ahead. The planning, though, that was mostly for the wedding. Dress fittings, tastings, the exact shade of green for the centerpieces. She built a spreadsheet that could have launched a rocket. Whenever I tried to talk about after the first trip we'd take as a married couple, what neighborhood we wanted to raise hypothetical kids in, whether we'd adopt a dog or a cat first, she changed the subject. We'll get there, she'd say, and I believed her because love is mostly faith with proof sprinkled in like confetti. 3 counseling sessions before the wedding, Pastor Anderson asked us what we were most excited for. I said stupid, sappy things about family dinners and inside jokes that last decades. Rachel said, very earnestly, a stable partnership, a foundation. He smiled at her like she'd handed in her homework early. I smiled too, but something about the way she said foundation landed in my chest with a dull thud. I ignored it. It's easy to take the thing that scares you and put a pretty frame around it. We were fine until the vows. If there's a door in the middle of life you pass through and everything on the other side looks the same but smells different, that's what the wedding was. The walk out of the church felt like stepping onto a stage. There was applause, photos, clinking glasses. We were a couple. People handed us envelopes and advice. Everyone said congratulations, like the word could bless us. That night she fell asleep on the far side of the bed, facing the wall. The next night she slept in the guest room because I snore sometimes. The next night because she had a headache. The next because she needed space. Space became a country I needed a passport to enter, and she kept denying my application. The first Sunday after the honeymoon that never happened, we had dinner at my mom's house. Mom made pot roast. Rachel balanced her fork on the edge of the plate and smiled politely when my mother asked too many questions about where we might live in 5 years. In the car home, I reached for her hand. She pretended to adjust the radio, and my fingers closed on air. I told myself she was tired. I told myself 100 things. I never quite got to telling myself the truth. The truth arrived anyway, unsummoned, like a relative who shows up with a suitcase and says they're staying for a while. Tuesday night in early November, we ate in silence. Rachel rose, gathered her plate, and disappeared into the guest room with a book I had recommended, but she'd never started. I sat and looked at our wedding photo again and felt like we were ghosts haunting the happiness of 2 other people. I didn't cry. I teach 8-year-olds how to do long subtraction without sobbing. I'm practiced in holding myself together when I want to come apart. But my hands were shaking. That's when I remembered the recordings. Pastor Anderson had asked our permission to record the premarital sessions for his notes. I revisit difficult conversations so I can help better, he'd said. We signed a paper. We never thought about it again. Until that night when the paper became a lifeline or a guillotine, depending on which side of the blade you ended up standing. I called him the next day during my lunch period while the kids were at art class turning paper plates into snowmen with alarming amounts of glue. He answered on the second ring. Ethan, he said warmly. How's married life? I don't know, I said. The answer surprised both of us. Do you still have the recordings? There was a silence that felt like a held breath. Yes, he said carefully. For a limited period. If I needed them, for legal reasons? Then we should meet, he said, and his voice gentled like he was talking to one of my students after they scraped a knee. Are you all right? No, I said, and I was grateful the word didn't break in two on its way out. That night, because I believe in giving people the chance to be the best version of themselves right up until they prove they can't, I told Rachel what I was thinking. I remember what you said to Pastor Anderson. I began, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall where she had retreated with her book. About marriage being about security. About not prioritizing intimacy. She looked up. The look on her face was not guilt. It was annoyance, like I'd interrupted her during the best part. What about it? He recorded those sessions. With our consent. Her expression changed. Just a flicker, a hairline crack in the calm. You wouldn't, she said. And then she caught herself, but the words were already out. Wouldn't what? Use those against me. That was private. Rachel, I said, and I felt my heart do the slow, painful miracle of hardening into something that could protect me. Did you ever intend to have a marriage with me? The kind where you share a bed. Where you kiss me goodnight without acting like it cost you something. She put the book down and crossed her arms in that way that turns a human into a barricade. I married you, she said. I'm here. I go to work. I pay half the bills. I do my part. If you expected some fairy tale, that's on you. And there it was. The contract in small print, read aloud. The next morning I sat with an attorney named Miriam Blake under a fluorescent light that made everything look a little bleached out. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. I told her everything. Not the sanitized version. Not the version where I'm a saint and she's a villain. Just the version that matches reality most of the time. Two flawed people, one of whom decided honesty was optional at the point where it mattered most. Annulment, Miriam said finally, steepling her fingers. Missouri recognizes fraudulent inducement. You have to show she misrepresented something essential to the marriage and that you relied on that misrepresentation. If she stated before marriage that she intended a partnership without intimacy and concealed that from you, those recordings are very relevant. She told him she planned to keep separate bedrooms. I said that she expected I'd just adapt. Miriam's eyebrows lifted a fraction. If the recordings say that, this is one of the clearer cases I've seen. It won't be easy. Contested annulments never are, but it's not impossible. Do you have a copy? Pastor Anderson is giving them to me this afternoon. Good, she said. Bring them. We'll review and file. On my way to the church, I passed a playground where a few bundled-up kids were taking turns on a slide that looked like it must have been freezing. A little girl went down, shrieked, laughed, and ran back up the ladder. Children run toward joy like they recognize it from across the street. Adults talk ourselves out of it until it walks away, and we tell ourselves it was never really that bright. The pastor had the manila envelope on his desk when I arrived. He didn't offer platitudes. He offered tea. That's a gift, not trying to fix what you can't. I revisited the recordings last night, he said quietly. I want to say I'm sorry. There were things Rachel said that I should have asked harder questions about. It's not your fault, I said, because it wasn't. He didn't put the words in her mouth. He simply captured them. Back in my classroom after school, I propped my laptop on a stack of picture books and pressed play. Her voice filled the room. Calm. Clinical, almost. She talked about needing space, about companionship over romance, about foundational stability. She used the word boundaries a lot, and if you didn't listen closely, it sounded like wisdom. But if you leaned in, if you listened like your future depended on it, you heard what she wasn't saying. That she had no intention of being a wife in the sense I had promised to be a husband. Not now, not later. That she expected me to accept it and congratulate her for being honest about who she was. Except she'd skipped the part where honesty includes the person you're marrying. The last session was the worst. Pastor Anderson had asked if we had any unresolved concerns before the wedding. I talked about my dad not being there and how I wished he could tell me something simple like, "You're going to be fine." Rachel said she felt relief about locking something down in her life, about having a secure base. When he asked if she and I had been aligned about physical expectations, she said, and I can quote it because I'll hear it for the rest of my life, "He'll adjust. He's not the type to insist." Pastor asked, "Have you told him?" She said, "I think he knows." Pastor said, "Does he?" And she said, "He will." I didn't realize I was standing until I heard the chair skid behind me. I leaned my hands on the desk so I could still remember how to hold my body up. Outside the window, a janitor pushed a mop down the hall, rinsed it, pushed it again. The world continued without consulting me. Miriam listened to 3 excerpts the next morning and nodded slowly. "We file today," she said. "She'll claim bodily autonomy. She'll say you're punishing her for refusal. These words show your claim is not about coercion, but about deception. We ask for annulment, return of wedding gifts, fees, and costs." "She'll hate me," I said. It sounded childish, like I was worried about a classmate being mad at me. But hatred has a way of cutting grooves in your life, and I'd spent months trying not to fall into one. "She already does," Miriam said without meanness. But you're not here to win her affection. You're here to tell the truth. Rachel cooked dinner the day she was served. Tenderloin, roast carrots, a salad with shaved fennel, and oranges like she'd printed the recipe from an aspirational magazine. She set the table with dishes we'd been gifted by my Aunt Denise. She lit a candle. "Can we talk?" she asked when I came in, her voice soft in the way that used to make me put down whatever I was holding and listen like a parishioner at confession. "Of course," I said and meant it. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know I've been distant. Marriage is an adjustment. I've had fears, but I want this to work. We can go to therapy. We can." Her eyes flicked to my mouth and away again. "We can be married in the way you want. I'm ready to try." I sat. The food looked beautiful. She always had that gift, making the exterior impeccable. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not try 6 weeks ago?" She swallowed. I didn't realize how serious you were about leaving." I took out my phone and played 20 seconds of audio. Not the worst line, not the bit where she called me, not the type to insist. Just the piece where she said she planned to maintain separate rooms after the wedding and address the rest later if necessary. She went still like prey. "You can't play that," she said. "It's private." "It was private until you made the marriage public and then crossed out the parts you didn't care for." Her eyes glossed with tears. "Ethan, please. We can fix this." "I believe you want to fix the consequences," I said gently. "Not the cause." She didn't slam her fist or raise her voice. She simply let her expression flatten back into the one she wore most days lately, clinical and unperturbed. "My attorney says you don't have a case," she said coolly. "He says a judge will see this as punishment because I didn't meet your demands." "I don't have demands," I said. "I have vows. They included truth. January in Missouri has a way of reminding you you're mortal." The day of the hearing was all hard edges and breath that ghosted the air. Rachel wore a gray suit I'd seen once during a school board presentation. Her attorney, a sleek man who looked like he ironed his hair, met my eyes like he was bored. Miriam wore black and a small silver cross that caught the fluorescence just so. The judge, Harper, took the bench with the patience of someone who has seen it all and isn't impressed. Rachel's attorney spoke first. He said a lot of words that sounded expertly practiced and morally outraged. He said bodily autonomy and punitive and coercion and dangerous precedent. He called our petition a retaliation. He never once said fraud. Miriam stood, clicked a small remote, and sound entered the room like weather. Rachel's voice, steady and measured, explaining what she wanted out of marriage as if she were describing a grant budget. Stability, independence, partnership with clear boundaries. The judge listened expressionless. Miriam clicked again, and there was the line, "He'll adjust." Another click, "Separate rooms." Another, "Not a priority." Words that might sound benign to some ears, but, layered together and placed on a timeline next to a wedding, became a blueprint. Judge Harper leaned forward. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "do you dispute that this is your voice?" Rachel swallowed. "No, Your Honor. You did not share these intentions with your husband prior to marriage." Rachel's attorney touched her sleeve, a tiny caution. She inhaled. "Not explicitly." The judge nodded once like a teacher marking a test with a red pen. "Annulment is granted on grounds of fraudulent inducement," she said. "Mrs. Calloway will return wedding gifts and pay petitioners reasonable attorney's fees and costs. Marriage is a contract predicated on good faith disclosure. This court finds that good faith was absent. There's no confetti when a judge ends your marriage. There's a stamp and a shuffling of papers and an odd feeling like you should apologize to the bailiff for making them watch you fall out of love in public." Rachel didn't look at me as we left. In the hallway, she reached out a hand and then dropped it like she'd accidentally touched a hot stove. "It didn't have to be this way," she said, which is true about most disasters and also not true at all. "It had to be the way where the truth wins," I said, "even if nobody claps." After that, the world didn't collapse. It adjusted. News travels faster in a school district than the flu. I didn't tell anyone. People told me instead. I heard, they'd say in the copy room, the way you say "bless you" after a sneeze, a reflex of polite society. A few colleagues who had adored Rachel during our engagement, her poise, her competence, stopped using her name. Parents quietly asked the district to assign a different social worker to their cases. I didn't rejoice. Revenge is not a parade. It's a quiet recalibration where the scales stop lying. Rachel tried a different strategy after she realized her social currency was shrinking. She made a post online about leaving an unhealthy marriage that attempted to control her body. Names weren't named, but the subtext blared. A mutual friend sent it to me with 3 question marks. I didn't answer. Miriam told me to say nothing. You've already said what matters in the forum that counts, she reminded me, which is why you hire lawyers. They keep you from turning your life into a comment section. Winter turned to a raw, reluctant spring. I started sleeping well again, the kind of sleep where you don't wake at 3 a.m. to stare at the ceiling like it has answers. I took my class outside to measure shadows with chalk on the sidewalk and teach about how the earth leans and light changes. Kids restored my sense of proportion. One of them, a boy named Tyson who chewed on his sleeves and whispered whenever he got excited, drew a shadow of himself and then added a cape. You're a superhero, I said. He looked up at me like I'd missed something obvious. Everybody is, he said. They just forget. In May, a letter arrived addressed to both of us from a cousin who hadn't gotten the memo and was asking if we wanted to spend a weekend at a lake house later that summer. Rachel never got her copy because she'd moved out of state by then. Someone told me she'd taken a position at a family services nonprofit in Illinois. I wished her well in my head. Sometimes the only kindness you can afford is the kind that doesn't require proximity. I went back to St. Mary's one evening when the light turned the stone facade the color of old honey. I didn't go inside. I sat on the steps where we'd smiled for photos and looked at the railing where the pigeons had lined up like ushers. I thought about vows and how they're not magic, they're promises. Magic doesn't survive the morning after. Promises do, or they don't, and either way you find out who you are. In the months that followed, I kept assembling a life. I bought a plan I knew would live even if I forgot it for a week, because reliable things teach you how to show up. I started running in the mornings before school along a path by the river. The city looks different at 6 a.m. Emptier, honest in a way it loses by noon. I answered my mother's question, "How are you?" with "better," and for the first time in a long time it wasn't a placeholder. Sometimes at night, I'd pull up the recordings, not to wallow, but to remind myself that my gut isn't a liar. There's a particular part where Pastor Anderson asks, very gently, "Rachel, have you told him?" And the silence that follows is longer than it needs to be. It sounds like a fork scraping a plate in an empty room. That sound is why I left. Not because love requires perfection, but because love requires honesty, and silence can be a kind of lie when you use it to avoid telling someone the truth they deserve. You want to know what revenge felt like? People expect fireworks, operatic finales, the villain brought to their knees in a tableau. It wasn't like that. Revenge was me telling the truth with evidence and letting the truth do the work I couldn't. It was a judge saying, without malice, good faith was absent, and the world adjusting its view accordingly. It was Rachel discovering that outcomes are not a buffet where you take the parts you like and leave the rest for the kitchen staff to throw away. I saw her one more time, accidentally, in a grocery store when summer was full and loud and the produce section smelled like tomatoes insistently being themselves. She was in town for the weekend, maybe. We made reluctant eye contact across the avocados. There was a flicker of everything we were and weren't. She approached like someone bracing for weather. "Ethan," she said. "Rachel, how are you?" she asked, which is the thinnest bandage we put on the deepest cuts. "I'm okay," I said, because it was true. She nodded. "I got the bill," she said, a humorless half-laugh. "The attorney's fees. That hurt." "The gifts, too," I said lightly, because if you can't laugh, you drown. My Aunt Denise asked for a receipt for the salad bowls. She looked at her hands. "I thought marriage would make other parts of life quieter," she said, surprising me. I was wrong. "So was I said. We stood there long enough for the misting machine to hiss on and then off again. I could have told her I forgave her. Maybe I do, in some corners of myself. But forgiveness isn't a balloon you release in public to prove how enlightened you are. It's something you let out of your hand in the dark and hope you don't need back. "Take care," I said, and meant it. She nodded, and we walked away into our separate aisles. I bought peaches. I ate one in the car with the windows down, and the juice ran down my wrist, and I laughed because it felt like proof that life still gives you sweetness without asking your permission. In August, a new school year began. 22 small humans learned my name, and then immediately started calling me Mr. See, the way they always do. On the first day, I asked them to write 3 things they want to learn this year. One kid wrote, how to make a volcano. Another wrote, how to multiply big numbers. And one girl, Eliza, wrote, how to tell the truth even when I'm scared. I wanted to frame it. I told them the truth is the bravest thing you can carry into a room. I told them it makes you heavy in the right ways. There's a woman who comes into my classroom on Wednesdays now. Her name is Mara. She volunteers to read with the kids who need extra practice. She is not Rachel. She doesn't remind me of Rachel, which is a mercy. She laughs loudly, sneezes like she's apologizing to the universe, and sometimes forgets her travel mug on my desk and texts me later. That tea was going to change my life. Rip. We've had coffee twice. We talk about everything but the quicksand we've both walked through. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Maybe we'll just keep telling the truth about the small things until we earn the big ones. When I think about the marriage that wasn't, I don't think about the courtroom or the check Rachel had to write. Those were consequences, necessary and antiseptic. I think about the moment in my kitchen under a buzzing light, a half-made sandwich in my hands, when I shifted the weight of the story in my head and set it down somewhere real. I stopped asking a locked door to be a window. I recognized the conspiracy I'd been part of, me, against myself, insisting that hope counts as evidence. Rachel wanted security without love, a roommate with a ring, a foundation without anything built on it. She wanted props so other people could applaud. And for a while I wanted to be the applause. That's the part that's hardest to admit, the role you play in your own undoing. You see, people will show you who they are, not by how they present themselves in a hallway with good lighting and new shoes, but by how they move once the ceremony ends and everyone goes home. She moved away from me. I kept calling it patience when it was really abandonment with better branding. If there's a moral here, it's this. Never confuse silence with kindness. Never confuse politeness with love. And never mistake a carefully curated spreadsheet for a plan to keep a promise. A promise is something you have to carry out of a church and into 100 ordinary Tuesdays. It's something you do when no one is recording you, and also when someone is. It's the thing you hold when you don't feel like holding it. It is, in short, the opposite of fraud. People ask sometimes, well-meaning colleagues, my mother when she's feeling nosy, a friend over beers on a patio lit by strings of little bulbs, if I regret marrying Rachel. I say no. Regret implies you could have learned the lesson for free. I couldn't. The cost was the point. It taught me the difference between being generous and being naive. It taught me how to hear the tone a person uses when they talk about you to someone else, and to take that tone seriously. It taught me that if someone plans a life with you in the privacy of their mind and forgets to invite you, you are not obligated to show up later and act grateful. One of my students, a boy with eyes like storm clouds softening, asked me recently why adults get married. He wasn't trying to be profound. He was looking for reasons the way kids look for sticks that look like swords. I said, because they want to tell the truth together for a long time. He nodded like this made intuitive sense. Maybe it always did. Sometimes at the end of the day, when the classroom is empty and the sun throws slanted light across the rug where we sit for read aloud, I put my hand on the back of one of our tiny chairs and feel the stillness in it. I think about how many small bodies it holds, how they fidget and spin and lean and still it stays. That's what I want to be in my own life. A chair that doesn't give way. Not a wall. Walls keep people out. A chair holds them while they rest. I don't hate Rachel. Hatred is a hobby, and I don't have time for one that takes that much maintenance. I do not wish her joylessness. I don't wish her anything, really, except the knowledge that telling the truth sooner is cheaper than paying for all the lies later. Maybe she knows. Maybe she tells herself a different story in the mirror each morning because it's the only way she can get to work. We all do that sometimes. The trick is to make sure the story eventually overlaps with what's real. The leather couch in my living room still creaks when I shift. It has the imprint of 2 people who sat on opposite ends and never quite met in the middle. Sometimes I sit in that exact spot and let the memory pass through me like weather. Then I lie down sideways across the cushions and take up space the way the person I am now is allowed to take it. I close my eyes. I do not bargain with the past. I do not drag the future into the room by the throat. I just breathe. The room smells like coffee and paper and the faintest trace of the kids' hand sanitizer, because those things get into your clothes and follow you home. My body belongs to me. You're not entitled to a thing. That sentence used to punch me in the sternum. Now I hear it and acknowledge the part of it that's indisputably true. No one is entitled to someone else's body. What she didn't understand, and what I do now, is that no one is entitled to someone else's life under false terms, either. Consent is not just for the body. It's for every promise you sign your name to. If you switch the contract after the ink dries, don't be surprised when the other party asks the court to shred the paper. I don't know what my life will look like 10 years from now. Maybe I'll marry again. Maybe I'll adopt a dog who looks at me like I hung the moon, and I'll become the person who keeps baked sweet potato in the fridge because the dog thinks it's a delicacy. Maybe I'll still be at Meadowbrook, older, still making volcanoes out of vinegar and baking soda with small people who think it's alchemy. I do know that I will require clarity in every room I enter. I will expect people to say the unsayable out loud before it becomes unlivable. When the kids asked me last week how to know if something is fair, I drew a scale on the board and placed imaginary weights on each side. Fair isn't always equal, I said. It's honest about what each person needs and promises and can give. They nodded like they were filing that somewhere they'd retrieve later. I hope they do. I hope one of them decides years from now to walk away from a beautiful lie because the truth may be plainer, but it will let them sleep. On my way home that day, the sky did that Missouri thing where it looks like a bruise healing, violet and blue and yellow at the edges. I rolled down the window, and the air smelled like rain before it decides. A couple walked their dog on the sidewalk, and the dog tried to greet everyone, tail windmilling, joy brutishly intact. I laughed out loud in my car like a fool, hands on the wheel, an entire life unfolding ahead that I get to live in good faith. That's the revenge Rachel never saw coming, the one I didn't, either, not the fees or the returned gifts or the memo that circulated quietly through the district. The real revenge is that truth gives you your time back. It furnishes your house with daylight. It puts a hand on your shoulder when the room is empty and says, "Steady now, you're doing fine." It doesn't clap. It doesn't need to. It just stands there and doesn't leave. That's enough. That's everything.